The Housing and Community Economic Development Committee will now come to order. We'll begin by announcing that item number 3 will be continued to the next scheduled meeting of this committee. Okay. We are commencing as a minority committee, as we do not have a quorum. And we'll begin with item number 1. Please read item number 1.
Michael Keck, CLA's office. Item number 1, Boonshed Cardenas Englander relative to authority to accept and administer a grant of $350,000 from the Southern California Gas Company to continue funding for the administration costs of the Federal Energy Efficiency and Conservation Block Grant programs administered by the General Services Department, LEHD, CDD, for the period of August 1st, 2012 to March 13, 2013, and CDD to report on administration and program details for the next proposed 2013-14 funding cycle.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll go to public comment first. Is there anybody here to make public comment on item number 1? I do not have any public comment cards before me on item number 1. I see no one come forward to make a public comment on item number 1. So public comment has been opened. It is now closed on item number 1. So with that, what we'll do is we will recommend approval of the motion. Okay, we'll go to item number 2.
Item number 2, LEHD report and resolution and CAO report relative to authority to issue up to $15,500,000 in tax-exempt multifamily mortgage revenue bonds for the Fickett Tower apartment project located at 14801 Sherman Way, Los Angeles, and approval of related loan documents. And this item is actually scheduled for council September 4th and not August 31st, 2012.
Okay, thank you very much. With that, we'll go to public comment first. Is there anybody here to make public comment on item number 2? I do not have any public comment cards filled out that are before me on item number 2. No one coming forward. Item number 2, public comment has been opened and it is now closed. So with that, it is a recommendation of the chair that we approve the CAO report on item number 2. There were no amendments to that report or any technical?
No.
No?
No.
Okay. Okay. Now we move to item number 4.
Item number 4, LHD and CAO reports relative to authorization to appropriate grant funds and create accounts to implement the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development Lead Hazard Reduction Demonstration Grant, create accounts and amend appropriations for the continued operation of 3 lead hazard reduction grants and Healthy Homes Production Grant through fiscal year 2012-13, execute contracts with existing handy worker contractors for the HHP grant, and amend contracts with 12 service contractors.
Okay. So with that, we will now go to public comment on item number 4. Is there anybody here for public comment on item number 4? I do not have any public comment cards filled out before me on item number 4. Seeing no one come forward on item number 4, public comment. Public comment has been open on item number 4. It is now closed. So with that, it'll be a recommendation of the chair that we approve the CAO report on this item. Next, we go to item number 5.
Item number 5 is continued from August 15, 2012 HCD meeting. Motion Weston for Cardenas, Krikorian, and CAO to report relative to the return of assets conveyed from the former Community Redevelopment Agency of Los Angeles to the city, including a list of properties to be returned to the CRALA, DLA, maintenance costs, required ordinances, and other authorities required to effectuate the return of such assets pursuant to an order to reverse from California State Controller in compliance with Assembly Bill AB 1X26. And this item is scheduled for council on Friday, August 31st.
Okay. Thank you very much. We'll start off with public comment on item number 5. Is there anybody here to make public comment on item number 5? We will have staff come forward, but item number 5, public comment. I do not have any public comment cards before me on item number 5, and see no one come forward for public comment on item number 5. Public comment on item number 5 has been open and it is now closed. So with that, if we can have the staff, including outside counsel, come forward to the table.
Good morning, Shafi Amir from the CAO's office. Before you is a report with a request to approve authorization to return 30 properties by number of grant deeds to the CRA as listed on attachment 1 of the report. while retaining 24, also as tallied by the number of grant deeds and listed in Attachment 2. The California State Controller has issued an order to reverse or claw back real property transfers which the city received from the CRA in 2011. As of February 1st, 2012, all redevelopment agencies were dissolved per California state legislation. In June 2011, the General Services Department received the transfer of CRA properties via 55 grant deeds. One of these properties, known as Engine House 18, was returned to CRA in January 2012 per CRA's request. In April 2012, after the conclusion of an audit conducted under the auspices of the state legislation dissolving the CRA, the State Controller ordered all cities and public agencies which received assets, including property transfers from CRAs in 2011, to return those assets. The properties recommended to be retained by the city include 19 housing asset properties, 19 as identified in a CRA list, which will need to be transferred to the Housing Department as part of the Housing Asset Transition Plan currently being formulated. 4 properties located at California Plaza, the Omni Hotel, and the Martin Luther King Jr. Shopping Center, which were transferred to the city as repayment of a debt obligation for Community Development Block Grants, CDBG loans, and properties which were transferred to the Department of Recreation and Parks, RAP, from GSD to be dedicated as parkland. All of the retained properties require further review and will be addressed in forthcoming reports. At this time, the city has not received information regarding specific costs to maintain the properties, with the exception of the Rec and Parks properties. CRA-LA staff are working to determine these costs. And just to add, we have Community Development Department staff here to answer further questions about the following, but they did want to point out that there are 4 properties which are on Attachment A to be returned, which are connected somehow to CDBG loans. 2 of the properties have CDBG loan obligations, and 2 of them have CDBG investments. Thank you.
Okay. First, if you could clarify for me, it appears that we're returning 30 properties to the CRA, and that the report shows 25 properties that will be retained by the city, but Attachment 2 shows 24.
Right. There was an issue with the way that the number of properties are referred to. The way that the attachments is by grant deeds, as the grant deeds that GSD received as far as what actually transferred over. What happened was, for instance, there were 19 housing asset properties that were identified by CRA as having been transferred, and as you see on Attachment 2, there's 16. The 19 number comes from a list that CRA compiled. There's multiple addresses, but they actually came over on less grant deeds. So the APN numbers are what we're using to make sure that we're talking about the same number of properties.
Okay.
But the references are different based on what CRA submitted.
Okay. The last thing I want is for the state to say that whatever system we're using to identify properties is incorrect. So what you just outlined, that's satisfactory to the state as far as how we identify properties?
We'll work with the CRA to make sure that we're talking about the same properties. And usually on all of the CRA lists, they included the APN numbers. And both of my attachments to this report are vetted by GSD as far as the APN numbers and what actually the city has on hand for title.
Okay. All right. Okay. Now, on the properties that are retained by the city, should the state argue with us or claim that we retain properties that we should not have, what is going to be the method of clarifying that and remedying that before they start to do things to us, and then we have to argue with them that
Right.
what they're doing to us is not fair?
Well, currently the status of the properties that we're retaining is that there are ongoing meetings and conferences going on with CRA on those. For instance, for the housing asset properties which are being retained, those would be subject to the Housing Asset Transition Plan, which is being worked on. So that should be clarified with CRA, and that's ongoing. For the California Plaza, the Martin Luther King Jr. Shopping Center, and Omni Hotel, that set of properties was transferred, had a council action that was separate from all the other council properties with the council action, and that is they were transferred specifically to repay a loan, a CDBG loan, And that is also something that's the subject of legal review, and issues and documents are being gathered on that. So, as well as the Rec and Parks properties, that will also require city attorney, meeting with city attorney and trying to resolve that. So in the meantime, before the state controller takes any specific actions, we are working on the status of these properties with legal counsel.
So if, for example, the state disputes the disposition of one of those properties that we retained, remind us again what their remedy would be, or penalty, or their way of showing us who's boss?
There is it's basically what's laid out in the state legislation for the CRA dissolution. So technically speaking, they are doing an audit of the assets of CRA. There is a December 15th, 2012 deadline for CRA LA to complete an audit by an accountant, which they procure regarding their assets. Then from the December 15th date to about April 1st, I believe it is, 2013, the findings of that audit will have to go through review by different levels of approval, which includes the governing board of the CRA LA, the oversight board, up through to the Department of Finance. April 1st is the date by which the Department of Finance has to determine the final available amount which CRA LA owes to the taxing entities. By that date, what they can do is include in their property values, which they determined should have been returned to CRA LA. At that point, the city could possibly incur, if CRA LA takes an action, to have a negative impact on future tax revenues by the value of the properties that were retained. But that's kind of a long, drawn-out process, the way that it's laid out in the legislation. By December 15th, the city should receive feedback as to what CRA determines whether these properties should be retained or not. But that's why we have this kind of ongoing process to determine before December 15th.
So at the end of the day, they won't necessarily send us a bill if anything's disputed and they feel that we owe something.
Based on the legislation and the process that I outlined, it would be more of an indirect type of cost to the city, and that's over time, after that point, between December 15th and April. Now, I should add that at any time, and this is happening, I think, to other cities, the state controller can send a letter to a city, or even the city of LA, and say, we want these specific properties back, or here's the whole list of properties, specifically city of LA, you need to return these properties. Right now, there's a general order that's to all cities. So that's kind of an unknown specifically when that might or might not happen.
But at the end of the day, they could determine that they're going to withhold money that normally they would give to the city of Los Angeles and say, well, we're not, you can argue with us all you want, but you're just going to get less money sent down to you that we normally would have sent.
Eventually, yes. Yes, that's correct.
So, okay. Now, when it comes to the 4 properties that are part of loans, are we receiving payments on all those 4 properties at this time, or?
I would like to defer actually to CDD staff if they have specifics on those regarding the CDBG loan properties.
Actually, I can answer that particular question. The 4 properties, Lisa Johnson Smith, the CAO's office, there are 4 properties that were transferred to the city in connection with a $50 million no-term CDBG loan. And as part of the property transfer, the lease revenues were going to accompany them as a repayment stream. Well, the lease revenue assignment was never made to the city of Los Angeles. At the last Oversight Board action, which I believe was on August 16th, the CRA did place it on their ROPS 3, $2.8 million, which is the net lease revenue up to January 2013. However, there are still unresolved issues regarding the transfer of the property and the lease revenues for repayment of the loan. So the money is subject to the resolution between the city and the CRA, or the release of the money to the city is subject to resolving those issues.
Okay. And then also, when it comes to the 2 park properties, those seem to be an interesting category. What's the likely disposition of that? Or what are we hoping that how the state sees those properties?
Actually, well, the current status right now, and we've talked with legal counsel on that, is that the city charter makes, once property is dedicated as parkland, it's in perpetuity. I did have a conversation with CRA LA staff on that, and they felt that it could remain as parkland even if it were transferred back. For them, it's the issue of the title and the clawback. The discussions with legal counsel have been that it's an issue of looking at whether the state legislation overrules that, and this is ongoing. But for more detail, we have our legal counsel here who can fill that in.
Properties that are in governmental use, AB 26 allows for the proper public entity, in this case, the city, to retain the property. So even if those properties were transferred back, the likely outcome is that they would come back to the city to be used as park. That's not a guarantee, because the retaining of property for governmental use as opposed to selling off to liquidate is discretionary, but our view is that those properties would most likely be able to be retained by the city for parkland.
Okay. And what could we expect that the CAO, along with the housing department, are you going to come back with some potential changes in the future?
There is a report that tentatively for September 2012, the report should be coming before this committee regarding the housing asset transition plan, or an update on that. And these retained housing asset properties would be subject and covered by that housing asset transition plan, as well as the other housing assets, which CRA still has title to. So they should be rectified, and their title should be rectified under that managed process.
In addition, that particular housing transition plan, I understand it's being scheduled for the CRA Oversight Board for Thursday, September 13th.
As long as there are properties in our possession, and let's say that a property, the state disputes that, and we end up saying, okay, fine, we're not going to argue with you, we'll give it back. What's the likelihood that we can actually attach to that they allow us to either retain funds or be credited funds for the maintenance and oversight of those properties while they were in our possession, if we did the proper thing and actually maintained them?
From my understanding, when these properties transferred over, the actual grant deeds were recorded and transferred in June of 2011. There hasn't been a change as far as the responsibilities, whatever CRA was taking care of remained so through this year, as well as if there were certain properties that the city had ongoing arrangements to pay for maintenance, and that's also remained the same. So as far as I know, there has not been a change regarding that up through today. There is, on a kind of a related note on that, properties which the city does have interests in and various issues involved with. These properties should be governed under, it's in the report, the housing, there's a long-range asset management plan, which the city anticipates giving input to CRA as for the final disposition of the properties. But I don't believe we have any kind of input or say as to the time period between last year and if we transfer them back regarding any costs incurred.
So the legislation is silent on what rights we have to any maintenance costs or any costs that would be borne by us that we could prove that we did the right thing?
I believe so.
That is correct.
It is silent.
Yes. There are 1484 provisions in the law that would allow the successor agency to collect tax increment revenues for maintenance of properties pending their disposition, but there's nothing in the law that would provide for costs to be provided to a city that took assets pending their return back to the CRA. So other than the arrangement that Shafia indicated, where CRA has been paying utilities and certain other costs while the city's been in possession of those properties. So that has been happening.
Well, then, if we did have incurred costs, could we then just ask CRA, so to speak, to go ahead and let the state know that these costs were incurred and that they concur with those costs?
We could attempt and
But you get what I'm saying? Because it
Yeah.
sounds like the legislation wasn't silent about CRA's right to those
That's
costs.
right.
But they were silent on if another party, such as a city, not a CRA specifically, was actually incurring maintenance costs and et cetera.
if CRA were amenable, that what they would do is put those costs on the ROPS, and then it would be up to the Department of Finance whether to approve or disapprove those costs.
They would have to be shown as an enforceable obligation, and they have a whole process for that, so.
Okay. But it was silent in the
Right.
specific legislation.
Right.
Any questions, Mr. Wesson?
Yeah, I have concerns more than questions. You know, I have a few properties that are kind of caught up in limbo here. The properties...
You mean in your district, not you personally?
In my district. That are one set of properties on Adams and Crenshaw, and the other one is in the Marlton Square area, where we're in the midst of what I believe is finally getting this thing developed. In fact, Ninos, you were in a meeting with my office yesterday as we were talking about how to go forward with this. Let's deal with Marlton Square. How does this action affect the ability for we, the city, to develop Marlton?
Ninos Benjamin from CDD. I will answer this question. There are two properties in fact, there are 4 properties on this list to return, which there are today CDBG obligations attached to it. The return of these assets to the city were not arbitrarily made. Were made in order to, in part, satisfy the obligations that city has to HUD, CDBG obligation it has. We have on here Westlake Theater, Alvarado Street, and Marlton Square property, we do have obligations, debt obligations on it. And we did have a first deed of trust on those properties. With respect to Old Watts Library and Robert Pitt's property, there are today CDBG obligations to be met. So return of these assets to the city were made in lieu of meeting the debt obligation. Maybe they did not meet the debt obligation 100%, maybe CRA owes us even more. But returning these assets, which previously we had deed of trust on them, now back to CRA will put us in a very uncomfortable situation, first as far as the new deed of trust, our claim for 100% recovery of the CDBG obligations, and potential of development, because if this property now goes back to CRA, I mean, then we have to go through another process, get it back from CRA. Would put development into limbo. I mean, it will be very difficult.
So what options do we have?
My recommendation is these 4 properties not to be returned. Because Councilman Cardenas mentioned about state powers, these are legislations, has certain rules, but I believe CRA rightfully returned these assets to us in order to meet their obligation. In my opinion, we shall not return it to them. And if in the future, through administrative process, state comes, insists to return these assets, I mean, we can exhaust that administrative process or face them any other way, judicially, but we have a right to these.
So do we have, were you with this, is anybody with the city attorney's office
Outside counsel.
or outside counsel?
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts?
And I also have Jim Grayson, who's also outside counsel, who's our real estate attorney. We've got 2 issues on there.
Hey, Jim, you can borrow this mic right here. You dropped your visitor's badge. You know, we throw you out for that.
It's hard to get in without one, too.
So one thing is, right now, as Shafia mentioned, the state controller is only given a general order to all cities to return all properties. We're anticipating any day, we don't know when, that the state controller will have audited each particular city and looked at each particular situation and will give a specific order. Until we see that specific order, we don't know what view the state's going to take on certain categories of properties. But the statute is written is that all properties are to go back. And so that, and I'll turn it over to Jim, is going to raise a title issue because of that factor.
Well, Jim, given what Mr. Benjamin said, how would you respond to that?
There is definitely a title issue because of the bifurcation of the title on record between the redevelopment agency, the former redevelopment agency, and the city.
So what does that mean in English?
That means in English that the property, the title that's held by the city now and the properties is unmarketable.
So that we have the title, the city of Los Angeles.
You have an unmarketable title. You have a title of record, but you have a title that's impaired. It cannot be insured by a major title insurance company without taking an express exception for the effect of AB 26 and 1484. And our experience has been that developers, and certainly lenders to developers, will not take title in that status.
So your suggestion or recommendation what I'm trying to do is this is a huge development. It will change the entire area, and it looks like we're close. And I would not want to give that up and have this thing be an eyesore like it's been for the last 13, 14 years. So do you have advice?
One way or the other, there has to be a unification of the title on those properties in order for you to move forward with your development. It can be done two ways. It can be done by transferring the property back, as is being proposed, and then in the process of the long-term asset management plan, working with the CRA-LA to develop a plan for the disposition of that property along the lines of what you're talking about as a development. The law as it now stands, as amended by 1484, permits that kind of an arrangement. It contemplates the possibility of the CRA-LA and the Oversight Board in the Department of Finance taking into consideration a proposed development of a piece of property along the lines of what could have been done under the previous redevelopment agency law. In other words, to convey the property to a developer who has, for instance, assembled property around the subject property that we're talking about here for the purposes of developing an integrated project. That is, however, going to be the result of some continuing negotiations, I would certainly think, between the city, your interest, and the developer's interest who's assembled the property, and the CRA-LA and the Oversight Board, to come to the conclusion that that makes sense, and that the value of the property, or what's to be paid for that property, and by the way, what's to be paid for that property to retire the debt that's on the deed of trust on the property now for the CBDG loans, is adequate and it's appropriate, and that it makes the project work. The other way to do it is to retain it, but until you just go through the same process. If you retain the property and not conveyed it back to the CRA now, you run two risks. One, that the state will take the position that that property needs to be returned, and the penalties that were just discussed are going to be applied. And you're still going to have to negotiate some sort of arrangement that's acceptable to the Oversight Board and the Department of Finance to unify the title.
So you're suggesting that maybe, or not suggesting, but one of your thoughts is that maybe we go ahead with this transfer and then try to negotiate this with the DLA?
One way or the other, we're going to have to negotiate something with the DLA.
And this action has to take place by when? The 31st?
The first deadline is,
We received the state order back in April of 2012, and subsequent to that, we've received two letters from the CRA-LA because we haven't returned these properties. The second letter was sent to us in June, basically stating for the properties that they were maintaining in terms of maintenance and operating costs, that they were going to terminate all of the maintenance and operating costs effective June 30th if we had not taken an action as a city to return these properties. At that time, the sales office requested a 45-day extension, which CRA granted. And so the deadline for CRA to turn off all the utilities, terminate services, actually was August 17th. They're giving us a little bit more time because we're going through this process.
And what's a little bit more time?
They haven't given us a date certain, but they said that as long as we're moving through the council process, and responding to the request.
so we're day-to-day right now with the CRA. Okay. But one of the things, Councilmember Wesson, former speaker, there is a deadline of this Friday night. I would imagine, I'm talking to our council, I would imagine that the state legislature has the right, before they adjourn this Friday night, if there was a properly written bill, maybe say a budget trailer bill in Sacramento, in the legislature that got to the governor that spoke specifically to this particular property, that then they could take action that would supersede the other previous bills that we've been discussing today. They could take action specific to the properties that Mr. Wesson just asked questions about, correct?
I believe if, with the appropriate findings of why a special legislation was required, they could.
They do that all the time.
Okay? Then that
They're very
would be
special up
my
there.
understanding, that they could.
They do very special things, and they do them within a few hours sometimes. Right, Mr. Former Speaker?
With that said, Mr. Chair, we should write this legislation, and I don't know who would take the lead on that. I don't know if it would be, Ninos, your department. I don't know if it would be
Housing.
with the mayor's,
Yeah.
I don't know. But we'll figure that out within the next few minutes. And then let me get the senator for that area to quickly put it in. And let's see if we can't get some legislative relief, see if we can't get an agreement from the governor's office. Mr. Cardenas, that's a good idea. Now, if that's unsuccessful, then I guess we will just
Continue with this.
continue with this process. So I'm going to get Andrew from my office to get to whoever you need to get with and get this written, and then see if we can get Senator Price to do it. Ninos, you want to
Yes,
say
I
something?
would like to add a few things here. Again, before this transfer of real properties to the city had a deed of trust, security interest in these properties. Today, we own the properties. As a result, the deed of trust that previously was there is extinguished, is gone.
Because we went from a deed of trust to a grant deed.
That's correct.
We went
Not-
from having an interest in this property of paper / encumbrance of dollars to actually being the owner.
That's-
So it would not have made sense for owner A, the city of Los Angeles, to have the grant deed, and owner A, the city of Los Angeles, have a loan
To
of
itself?
piece of paper to itself. But when did we go from deed of trust interest in the property to grant deed ownership interest in the property? When was that?
That was about June of 2011, when all the properties were transferred. Now,
But the legislation speaks to actions in general that occurred in 2011,
Right,
that
and-
we shall
legislation is
put
very...
property back to its previous terms.
Legislation is very
Yeah,
general.
it should be added that in February 1st, when the CRA was, the state legislation was effective, dissolving the CRA and also dissolving any agreements it may have had, and kind of the default by the state controller letter, which Lisa referred to in April 2012, set all property transfers by the CRA, no matter what reasons, which occurred before, when there was a CRA. Technically, the CRA
Yeah.
is dissolved February 1st, are considered null and void, so reverse those those asset transfers, with the exception of those that may possibly be, that had prior obligations to third-party contractors prior to June 28, 2011. And then if there's some sort of enforceable obligation, which can be found in connection to those would be.
But there was an enforceable obligation before we went from trust deed to grant deed interest in the property, right?
That's correct.
We had
Prior
trust
to-
deeds against the property.
It would have to be prior to June 28, 2011.
There has been always an enforceable obligation of CDBG funds against those properties. So this idea now that to return the real property back to the state, what will happen to the deed of trust the city
Exactly.
has?
So, but I'm sure the legislation is silent to remedy of technicalities like that. In this particular case, on this
I would- yeah.
property, we did have enforceable obligations, but because of the practical nature of what we tried to do, I would say tried to do, because now we're being told that doesn't count, shouldn't we go, should we revert these properties back to CRA? Shouldn't we at the same time rearrange for these trust deeds to be, these trust deed obligations to be put back in place?
There is the idea of the merger between the debt and the fee, that's the fairly standard arrangement, is correct. The issue here is twofold. First of all, the legislation in AB 26, it makes the legislative findings necessary for a determination that the original transfer from the agency to the city was void ab initio from the beginning.
And that's the power of the state
That there was
legislature.
no fee actually transferred.
Correct.
And that's the problem that the title companies are having. If the fee was never effectively transferred, because the legislation says that was beyond the scope and authority of the Community Redevelopment Agency law, then there will be no merger. The deeds of trust that pre-existed with respect to the city would still remain in effect, because to have a merger, you have
Yeah,
to
but they don't exist right now.
I'm sorry?
Those deeds don't exist
The
today.
deeds of trust still exist unless they have been reconveyed or they have been acknowledged to have been canceled by payment.
You know,
What did we do? He just pointed out the different ways in which we should have done it right, let's just say. That's my words. So what did we do?
the situation is very simple. I'm hearing two different things. Legislation is saying blanket return all assets, or legislation is saying unless there was an enforceable obligation, unless there was a reason to return those assets, those are good. So in this case, there was a CDBG obligation. There were 5-6 properties, non-performing CDBG obligation. We sent notice of default to CRA that these have been non-performing assets, and subsequently CRA, in order to meet their debt obligation, CRA had an asset and a liability.
Correct.
In order to extinguish their liability, they think that by transferring their asset, they will extinguish their liability. And we have taken that property. Now, the idea of returning the same asset back to CRA, reestablishing the deed of trust, for us to take it back again.
Can we clarify? I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just want to clarify which properties we're talking about, because we are retaining, if you look on attachment 2, we are retaining the California Plaza, Omni Hotel, and Martin Luther King Jr. shopping center properties. And those properties together were indicated by CRA and approved in a council motion last year in fulfillment of an aggregate loans totaling around $50 million CDBG loan obligations that they had to the city. So we are recommending to retain those properties, those specific properties for those set of CDBG ones. I just wanted to clarify, I guess, my own confusion if we're talking about different ones.
Excuse me, Marlton Square is on the list of properties to be
To be
transferred.
returned. Okay, yeah,
to
I just
CRA.
want, because it sounded almost to me that we were talking about.
I am talking about number 4 and number 9, number 25 and 26
Okay.
only.
And those are the Marlton Square.
Those are the ones you're
Yes.
referring to.
Well, I mean, Ninos makes a very good argument. And so I just think I need to spend a little more time, Mr. Chairman, trying to figure out, seeking more advice. Because I think, again, Mr. Benjamin makes a good argument. Basically, they gave us this property
In lieu of debt.
because of debt. And now we've got to give it back to them?
And then reestablish our debt to take it back again.
Yeah, I mean, well.
That's a little weird, Jim.
But see, the thing is that's the nature of the state legislature in California. They're light on details when they make this sweeping legislation.
They clearly did not contemplate this situation.
Exactly.
And this situation is more common than they imagine of the
Would-
legislature.
Could we make a good argument to retain these properties? Would it be worth the discussion or the debate?
But see, with all due respect, maybe the word retain/delay the transfer of these properties until we can get better clarity, but there's a problem. It's my understanding that the state controller's office isn't dialoguing on specific properties. They don't want to. It's a brain hemorrhage for them. They don't want to talk about specific properties right now. They just want to force us to say, you better decide where you're going to draw that line. You better be right. Send properties back. If you retain properties, you better be right, because if you're not right, then we are going to come down with our hand and either snatch them back, penalize you and snatch them back, etc. That's pretty much what we're faced with, right? We have to make the best determinations we can at this time,
That's correct.
hoping to be right. And whatever, if we transfer properties back and retain some properties, then we've made a clear decision, and we could be punished for it if we're wrong, right?
That's the dilemma we find ourselves in.
Two things
Dinos?
about the shadow of title for title insurance purposes. We have two lists here. So it applies to both of them. We are retaining some, so shadow of the title remains.
That
on
doesn't
both.
mean because we retain them, they have clear title, or the title companies would be willing to
Might
insure.
not insure it. Now, so that's on that subject. Supposedly, we return these assets to state, to see new DLA, CRA. We would ask immediately authority from council for us to foreclose on all of them, because they have been non-performing for so many years. We will foreclose and we will own them, and we will go for deficiency judgment against CRA. Because we have a deed of trust on all of them. We have a CDBG
Do we?
obligation. We have a deed of trust we had in all these properties.
No, but had and have are two
Now we do not have, but if we return it and deed of trust is reestablished,
Exactly.
we will immediately ask for right to foreclose. We will foreclose and we will own the property, proceed with what
But
we...
Ninos, there's a fundamental problem that I understand. If we try to reestablish a deed of trust, then we have the other party that we're establishing the deed of trust with, the owner of the property, could dispute whether or not those deed of trusts are valid. Because we're trying to take action, there would have to be a mutual understanding that those are enforceable by both parties. Otherwise, we're back to just arguing about it.
Councilman, will get a lot more complicated because we funded these properties when the value was very high.
Mhm.
So CRA paid very high price for this. Now they have returned them to us at a depleted value. Today, we have a case to go ask for deficiency judgment because CDBG rules and direct communication from HUD is asking us to return 100% of the money. So now, if value was here, now we establish a new deed of trust here at lower level, will be very complicated situation, and they will have a lot of arguments that, well, you might not be entitled to the deficiency judgment. So this is, I don't know, will complicate matters a lot more than it's necessary.
Yeah, we think it's difficult dealing with the state. The feds talk about a heavy hand.
But there is
Whatever they say goes at the end of the day.
supremacy of the federal law, CDBG fund, federal funds. If state can withhold money, well, federal government can withhold money. We have communication from HUD. They want 100% of this money back because these projects have not been performing for a long time. And so now, with some of them we have plans, with some of them we should have a plan. But now that we have the properties, returning it back, reestablishing the deed of trust for us to foreclose on it and get it back and implement what city legislators would like to do is complicates matter a lot more. And in my personal opinion, we have a very compelling case for these properties to keep the 4 properties that I mentioned here.
Any comment from our legal counsel?
Not without making it even more complicated than it's become. I think that
But see, the thing is, the one thing that I would want to say on the record is that the dialogue we've had over the last 15 minutes on this category of properties, it's not trickery. We're not trying to hoodwink anybody or what have you. We're just trying to get the properties in the proper disposition of who owns them, what kind of liens, legal liens and appropriate liens should be retained against the properties, et cetera, because the money, as Ninos mentioned, is very complicated. We've got federal funds, we've got other funds, et cetera, and we have an obligation to, forget about the chain of title, we have an obligation to make sure that the chain of events are actually accurate and that somebody can't honestly say that we just swept something under the rug, which the feds don't allow us to do that at the end of the day anyway. But the backdrop of all this is if we weren't local government and we didn't care, then we would just throw them back to the state and say, they're complicated pieces of dirt, you deal with it. But the way the state would deal with that kind of asset is they would let it sit feral, which causes a blight on a community, and 10 years for the state of California on a feral piece of land that they have title to doesn't mean anything to them. But it adds a big problem to the broken window issue that we have in certain communities. So unfortunately, we're forced to try to figure out how do we legally put these properties in the proper disposition with the proper legal documents, attachments properly attached to these properties so that we can hopefully see them go from dilapidated properties to developed properties for the sake of the community, for the sake of jobs, for the sake of economics, for the sake of improving the crime situation. I know, Councilmember Wesson, I know it's messy to do legislation, but the legislation that we're contemplating right now was messy.
No, I get it.
And it was broad brush, sweeping legislation affecting the entire state of California. So from my vantage point, if there's any way that we could get properties like these legislated with legislation and signed.
Well, the key would be signed, because I do think this is complicated, but where it relates to the district that I represent in these properties, we will attempt some form of legislation. But I think I would like to spend more time with legal counsel and Mr. Benjamin to see if we couldn't defend what he is saying as a backup, because I am not inclined to release these properties.
So this is what I'll move, Councilmember Wesson, that we send forward the that we approve and send forward the CAO report as a minority committee, and that we retain these 4 properties in the committee for deliberation and discussion on the meeting of September 19th. And that means the 4 properties are on the attachment labeled properties to be transferred to CRA LA-DLA. We are talking about item number 4, item number 9, item number 25, and item number 26.
I'm fine with that.
Okay? And with all due respect, we are, at least as far as the CRA goes, we're on borrowed time on a day-to-day basis. Let's make sure that they understand what we did. Let's make sure they understand why we moved the report forward without those 4. And just know that I'm more than happy to speak to Chris Essel. I presume that she's still there, and she's calling the shots for an organization that exists but doesn't exist. And I'll explain to her myself why we did that. Again, this is not trickery. We're not playing games. We understand the seriousness of this. We understand the heavy hand of the state at the end of the day if they think that we are playing games, but we're not playing games. This ultimately comes down to not only the disposition of these properties, but how can they move forward as actual physical properties when it comes to changing them from their current state to eventually getting them into a better state.
If
Yes.
it might, if it gives you comfort on this, we are deeply into the research on the question of the federal supremacy issue that involves the enforceability of liens or repayment obligations with respect to monies that were derived from CDG loans and related types of grants.
Mhm.
So that the issue is not yet finally resolved because, as you might
Okay.
imagine, there is no
But
precedent.
why would we
Under-
recommend, Jim, that we give these properties back if we haven't fully vetted the federal concerns?
Because the idea would be that if you're playing the pressure of having to take an action before the state begins to raise issues with respect to the transfer, and you move forward towards the deadline when ugly things could happen under that legislation with the city. If you were to conclude during that process that the federal supremacy issue is, in fact, controlling in these situations, then the repayment of those loans will have to be made by the CRA one way or the other, whether it's physically with the properties or whether it's a requirement that that debt be put on the ROPS and approved and paid. It's a question of money on the security interest in the loans. It's not necessarily a question of property.
Last question, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
In the event that we decided just to retain it, could you defend it? Would we win?
With whom?
I guess the state, right?
State, basically the
I think the
controllers.
state would take the position, this is without having concluded yet any final determination on the review of the law, but I would think that the state would have a fairly good argument that if the property is required to go back and they otherwise take care of the debt obligation, then you would end up not with the property, but with the repayment of your debt.
Let me, on this subject, there are two aspects to CDBG funding. One, financial obligation. Second is regulatory obligation. CRA can repay the debt, but who will meet the national objective? Where's the project? Where are the jobs? Where are the services? Please realize we have communication from HUD that either return the money now, or if we do not do something, this might hit general fund. So it's not only financial obligation. Objective is to have a project. There is change of use from slum and blight to a retail on Malton Square, for instance. On Westlake Theater to be a community-based incubator to create jobs. Or different projects have different national objectives. So we are dealing with multiple aspects of this. There's regulatory aspect of HUD, financial obligations, and state administrative proceedings. And end of the day, if anybody can make all kind of claims, so that's why there are judicial proceedings for that. So in this case, we have a deed of trust. We had a deed of trust. We've had, correct. And the borrower decided to transfer the property back to the city. I think, and honestly, we are not finished with that because we had about $14 million debt, 108 loan, deed of trust on these properties. They returned it to us. I do not know at what value we have contemplating to establish what is the return market value. In fact, we are obligated to go back to CRA, give us the difference even, the balance between the...
It's complicated, Nino, so I get it.
Yes, go ahead.
And I'd also like to add one more thing, Lisa Johnson-Smith, CAO's office. The ROPS 3 that the Oversight Board just approved, that's getting ready to move forward to the DOF, CRA Oversight Board did approve 3 different CDBG 20-year loans for repayment to the city under the federal supremacy argument premise. So 2 of the loans are maturing between now and the end of June, so they're approving full principal and interest. One of the loans actually is maturing in 2021, I believe. So they approved a partial payment of $1.2 million. The total amount that was approved for payment from the January through June ROPS period is a total of $9.9 million. And that is subject to DOF approving the reasons, but I just want to let you know that they have shown that the Oversight Board, that they have approved 3 different loans from CDBG.
Okay, great. So on the 19th, if we could get those kinds of our own opinion of those extrapolations and the previous liens on these 4 properties, mainly, it seems like the most complicated one is Malton Square. If we could actually have an understanding as to what those previous obligations were, what the maturity dates were, et cetera, on all of those obligations, so we can actually understand the complicated picture that we had before they were transferred, and then the complicated picture, should they get transferred back, what obligations we could expect that they would reasonably agree to, like you just pointed out. Hopefully, they would, right? Okay. Okay. So with that, that'll be the disposition of item number 5 to move it forward without those 4 items, those 4 properties.
So, Mr. Chair, just to clarify, so we are approving the CAO report with an amendment to eliminate items number 4, 9, 25, and 26 properties as detailed in attachment 1 of the CAO report.
Correct.
And the city is choosing to retain those properties.
We're going to retain them in committee for discussion on the 19th.
Okay.
Yes, they would fall into the category of retained.
Okay, and
By
instruction for CAO to report back September
Uh-huh.
19th with additional information.
Yes.
Okay.
All right, thank you. Is there anybody here for general public comment? I do not have any general public comment cards before me. I see no one come forward for general public comment. General public comment is now closed for this committee. This committee is now adjourned.